Showtime. I will welcome everyone to Presidents and Music. This is a topic dear to me. It was inspired by a visit to the National Portrait Gallery where I docent by the National Symphony Orchestra. And the Kennedy Center was interested in seeing if there might be a tour that we could do in conjunction. And since we specialize in presidents, we said, well, why not? So here we are a few years later, and I'd like to share some of the things I learned then and maybe even since. So what did presidents actually think about music? Well, we have their own words. Nothing is more agreeable and ornamental than good music. George Washington. Music is the pet of your mother and father. Rutherford B Hayes. I console myself with the idea of being an American and therefore not susceptible of great musical powers. John Quincy Adams. Music is the favorite passion of my soul. Thomas Jefferson. We cannot have too much music. We need it. The world needs it. Warren Harding. Music is the art directly representative of democracy. And that's Calvin Coolidge. So we do know that even George Washington, who didn't live in the White House, but had a granddaughter who played the piano beautifully, that he encouraged her, he bought her an instrument. So presidents actually had an advantage. First of all, they have their own song, Hail to the Chief, which actually became popularized when John Quincy Adams in 1828 did the groundbreaking for the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And even earlier, the president has his own band, the Marine Band, which was created by law in 1798. And it was to Thomas Jefferson who actually came to call it as the president's own. So music has very much been a part of a president's life, whether living in the White House or out the activities beyond. So if we go to the next slide, Jonas, we'll start to see how presidents have used music during their presidencies. So in this next slide, we can see, well, how do you get to the White House? You have to be elected. So the political arena is certainly one where music has played a meaningful role, going well back to the early 1800s, mid 1800s. By 1840, William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, their campaign was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And interestingly, at that time, sheet music was very prevalent and extremely popular. There could be as many as 1 million pieces, 1 million copies sold of the same work. So on the left, we see Dwight Eisenhower, and who is he there with? Irving Berlin, the fantastic Broadway composer. And these two men actually met during World War II in 1944 in London. Berlin had written a special program to raise funds, and Eisenhower saw it and loved it. And Irving Berlin became a fan. So much so that by 1950, Irving Berlin writes a Broadway show called Call Me Madam, and it has a song called They Like Ike. It's a situation where members of Congress are gathering overseas at Ethel Merman's appointment abroad. And they're saying, well, who's going to take over for Truman? Well, we want somebody affable. And so their response is, they like Ike. So Berlin changed the lyric to sing, I like Ike. And Eisenhower was a reluctant candidate. He was head of NATO in Europe. He didn't want to be drafted. And lo and behold, in February of 1952, the cast of Call Me Madam does a performance at Madison Square Garden. There are, I think, 15,000 supporters, and it's a marvelous show. And Eisenhower actually got to see it on film afterwards, and he was quite moved. So who knows if that was not what prompted him ultimately just a few months later to decide to run for the presidency. And he won. In the center, you see two presidents. At the top in the photograph, to the left, the man with his arms crossed is Warren Harding. And below him is Calvin Coolidge, who succeeded him after Harding died in office. Just next to them, on their left, on the right, is the same man, Al Jolson, the consummate entertainer. He created The Jazz Singer, the great film that broke the sound barrier from silent movies. And he remained a significant figure in the entertainment world for quite some time. And he was a very enthusiastic supporter and promoter of both of those candidates. But even earlier, we can go back in 1904, there's Theodore Roosevelt. He has succeeded upon the death of McKinley, this time an assassination, and who has written a campaign song for him with two brothers, James Weldon Johnson and his brother Rosamond. James Weldon Johnson is probably best known for Lift Every Voice and Sing, known as the Negro National Anthem. Well, they had become very successful Broadway musical writers, and there was a club of Black Republicans. And so they decided they were going to write a song. They forwarded it to Booker T. Washington, who was good friends with Theodore Roosevelt. And what was Roosevelt's reaction? Well, that's a really good song. And he got elected. So if we go to the next slide, Jonas, we'll see another way in which presidents used music, and that is in the field of diplomacy. How much sweeter things are when there's music. And in the top left, we see a print, and that is President Grant, Ulysses Grant, greeting the King of Hawaii, King Kalakaua. And this is 1874. It's the very first visit of a head of state to the White House. And so it is the first time the Marine Band performs. And it was a charming evening, and that has become a tradition for heads of states when they arrive. But that was the first time. In the photograph just beneath that, that is Van Cliburn playing the piano in the East Room during President Ford's administration, 1975. The occasion being the first time the Emperor and Empress of Japan, imagine this is 30 years after the war has ended, and they are making a state visit. And the reason the audience is standing is Cliburn is playing a beautiful arrangement of the Japanese national anthem. But Van Cliburn's position as maybe an instrument, pardon the pun, of diplomacy is that back in 1958, the height of the Cold War, this American, this tall, lanky Texan, goes to Moscow for the Tchaikovsky competition, and he plays Tchaikovsky. Doesn't that take a little bit of chutzpah? But the Russians adored him, and with the consent of Nikolai Khrushchev, he was awarded the first prize. So Van Cliburn returns to the United States to great acclaim, the only musician, I believe, to have a ticker tape parade in New York City. So that certainly was an interesting way for music to have been used in diplomacy. But music again became significant and meaningful for President Carter, Jimmy Carter there in the center. Seated next to him are Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt, and Menachem Begin from Israel. They had come to Washington in 1979 to sign a treaty ending hostilities. It's a major event in Middle East history, the first Arab nation to make peace with Israel. And at the state dinner that night, the Army Chorus had prepared a special compilation and arrangement that included both Egyptian and Israeli folk songs. And that was not the only occasion when Carter had a special event in honor of a treaty. You may recall that there was a treaty involving the Panama Canal. And so heads of states from all of the Americas came together, and there was just a wonderful concert. There was another very significant historic diplomatic occasion, and that is in the top right. You may recognize President Mrs. Kennedy. They were entertaining the governor of Puerto Rico, and the gentleman holding the cello is none other than Pablo Casals. This is 1961. It is not the first time Casals has played for a president. He actually had played for Theodore Roosevelt more than 50 years before. But what made his reappearance in 1961 so significant diplomatically is that Casals had left Spain upon the election of Franco. It was a fascist regime, and Casals had pledged that he would never appear or play in a country that recognized Franco's government. And at that time, the United States did recognize Franco. But Casals felt so strongly and had such great admiration for President Kennedy that he made an exception. And that is quite meaningful. So much so that this concert became internationally renowned. It was broadcast on radio nationally, and a recording was made of that concert. And it was, in fact, to Puerto Rico that Pablo Casals emigrated after leaving Spain. So it was a meaningful evening. And in the last picture here on the bottom, that is President Clinton holding his beloved saxophone. And who is he waving to? But Boris Yeltsin. He'd gone to Russia in 1994, and all the secretaries and foreign ministers are meeting there. They're having a dinner, and Clinton is about to play a jazz saxophone for the attendees, and everyone seems to be smiling and having a good time. So what more to celebrate if we see on the next slide, actual celebrations. So what's the very first thing that a president does? They get inaugurated. After being elected, you get inaugurated. So in the top, we see Itzhak Perlman and Yo-Yo Ma as part of a quartet playing an arrangement of Simple Gifts arranged by John Williams. And this was in honor of the election of President Obama, a very historic occasion. But it's not the first time there had been music played at an inauguration. Sometimes the Marine Band played. But when Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, he loved opera. And so there was some opera played. I don't know if there's been opera at inaugurations since then, maybe opera singers, but the first time that music was actually commissioned for an inaugural was for John F. Kennedy. And Leonard Bernstein wrote a special fanfare for that. And another composer wrote a piece as well, John Lamontagne, From Sea to Shining Sea. And there are certainly wonderful events that happen in the White House itself, including weddings. There have been 18, but the picture you see here, the print, is Grover Cleveland, the only president to marry while president, and his wife, Frances Folsom, had been his ward. And he gave as a wedding gift to his wife a Steinway piano. Cleveland himself had been the attorney for the Steinway Company, and the Steinways were very active later in organizing programs at the White House. But the Clevelands were the first president and first lady to lend their support for the arts, and Mrs. Cleveland took an interest in promoting the careers of young musicians. On the top right, we see another rather special occasion. It is President Nixon on the left. He is on stage with Bob Hope as MC, standing next to Mrs. Nixon. And that, again, that's Irving Berlin in the middle, with Sammy Davis Jr. and Vic Damone, the singers, in the background. And what was this occasion? It was to celebrate the return of the POWs from Vietnam in 1973. It was a huge event. The president enabled all of the POWs to ramble around the White House. They could go anywhere. And it was just a wonderful celebration. And Bob Hope seemed to be the appropriate MC, in as much as he had for many, many years, unfortunately, traveled overseas during wartime to entertain the troops. And I think he also may have gone when it wasn't wartime, but he was a great morale booster with his beautiful young women traveling with him, and also his great sense of humor. And a more contemporary celebration is Black History Month. That is President Obama. I think of him as crooner in chief. He has a great voice. And he is singing with B.B. King and Mick Jagger to Sweet Home Chicago. Now, this was part of the In Performance at the White House series that actually broadcast on PBS, and it goes back to the Reagan era, although President Carter and Mrs. Carter had televised some Sunday afternoon concerts, but it became formalized as In Performance at the White House many occasions. And in fact, it is the site where the Gershwin Prize, established by the Library of Congress, is now performed. And sadly, there have been other times to celebrate the life of someone, and that was President Kennedy. Sadly, after his death, a number of works of music were composed in his memory. And on a happier note, it was President Lyndon Johnson who presented the first presidential medals to musicians. And those two people were Leontyne Price and Aaron Copland. So we move on to the next slide. And certainly one role of the president is to increase morale and promote patriotism. And here we are again with Theodore Roosevelt. You can see his image there with his wife Edith on the left on the program. They had 8 musicales every year, as many as 300 people or more at each one. But what he particularly did was to promote American music and American composers, including a woman, Amy Beach, whose work we hear more and more today. Also Edward MacDowell and Arthur Foote. But something very unusual and different, he also wanted to promote the music of Native Americans. And so there was an opera based on Native American music performed while he was in the White House. And having a daughter like Alice, who was very forward in many ways, ragtime for the first time was heard. Definitely a new century coming. And then the figure in the blue suit with the bowler hat is George M. Cohan. He was a vaudevillian, part of a performing family. He was quite well known. He composed many, many standard songs, but he was recognized by FDR in 1940 he gave him a gold medal for his World War I patriotic songs. I don't know if you would know the song, Over There, and many others. And 1940, if you think about it, that is a time when Europe has already been at war for about a year. So perhaps this was FDR's way of softening up the American public, which had been very isolationist, to support our allies in Europe. So much so that a film of George Cohan's life was produced in 1942, starring James Cagney, called Yankee Doodle Dandy. Another thing that FDR did when the United States did actually enter the war is to send the quite renowned, world famous Black tenor Roland Hayes to perform a concert for the troops in England, as well as to report back on the morale. So music and musicians are playing a meaningful role. And then we move back a little bit to Herbert Hoover, FDR's predecessor. And what was his role with music? Well, he is the president who formally signed the statute designating the Star-Spangled Banner as our national anthem. Though interestingly, since Francis Scott Key had written the poem during the War of 1812 set to the music of, I think it was an English tavern song, the United States had basically adopted it informally as its national anthem. So that by 1916, Woodrow Wilson decided, well, I'll just sign an executive order and say it is. I'll just make it real. But an executive order can be changed. But making it statutory with Hoover made it the real deal, as it were. Going back to the Roosevelt days, you can see a photograph there at the top of Eleanor Roosevelt with Marian Anderson. Mrs. Roosevelt had facilitated the ability of Miss Anderson to sing an Easter concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when the Daughters of the American Revolution had denied her the opportunity to sing in Constitution Hall. That was April 1939. Just a few months later, Mrs. Roosevelt and the president invite Mrs. Anderson back to Washington to sing at the White House for the King and Queen of England. So it's a little hard to top that as a musical gig at the White House. Mrs. Roosevelt also was interested in entertaining the troops. And so there was a program created, you see on the right there, of American songs for American soldiers. And one of the entertainers was Burl Ives, who later became an actor, but he was quite a wonderful folk singer. And then you may recognize the last image on the bottom right, a rather iconic one of Harry Truman playing the piano, and looking down at him from atop is Lorna Bacall. Well, how did this come about? This is February 1945. Truman is still vice president, doesn't have a lot to do. And he said, well, one day, well, I'm going to go to the National Press Club. There's a canteen there for the soldiers, and I'll just go play the piano. And he couldn't resist a piano when there was one around. And so when he arrived, it turns out who else is present? Lorna Bacall with her agent. She was still very much a starlet. She hadn't quite established her professional reputation along with her later husband, Humphrey Bogart. And it was the agent who suggested to Miss Bacall, why don't you just jump on the piano? And it certainly looks as if Truman is happy to entertain her there along with the troops. But I'm not sure Mrs. Truman was quite as pleased. But this became such an iconic image that when Truman ran for the presidency in 1948, Ben Shahn, a social realist and very progressive artist, created a poster with Truman playing the piano and who plays the role of Lorna Bacall, his opponent, Thomas Dewey. So that image has definitely entered the American memory, as it were. So being a president is a tough job. So we'll see in the next screen, Jonas, that presidents used music as a way to relax and escape the challenge of their job. And it was in fact John Tyler back in the 1840s who established these free Sunday afternoon concerts on the White House lawn with a Marine band. And they continued until Herbert Hoover's presidency. In fact, there's some speculation that the reason Washington didn't have a symphony orchestra like New York or Philadelphia in earlier days was because the community had this wonderful access to music every week or during the spring and summer for free. And Abraham Lincoln very much enjoyed listening to the soldiers and the civilians singing spirituals and patriotic songs. So it was very meaningful for the presidents. That is FDR listening to a radio on the top right. He had been a singer. He had taken singing lessons as a young man. And he and Mrs. Roosevelt both enjoyed listening to the Metropolitan Opera broadcast by radio on Saturday afternoons. So much so that he wrote to the Metropolitan saying that the Met is the people's opera. Down in the lower left corner, there is President Carter sitting on a sofa next to Willie Nelson. The two men were very, very good friends. In fact, I think there's a recent documentary that's come out about President Carter being referred to as the rock and roll president. And there were a number of rock and roll performers who helped support him during his campaign. Well, President Carter enjoyed lots of kinds of music. He really loved classical as well. He just liked music. But he and Willie Nelson had a very special relationship. And sadly, during his tenure as president, Iran took hostages when there was a change in administration there. And it was for many, many months that the president every night was struggling, and every day trying to figure out, how can I bring these people home safely? And at night, what he would do as a form of solace, he would listen to Willie Nelson's rendition of Amazing Grace. And there we see the last picture there is President Clinton, and he is playing his favorite instrument, which almost led him to become a professional musician, his saxophone. And this is in the music room that was created for him on the 3rd floor of the White House, fortunately soundproofed. And he would go up there and play for several hours at a time. It was just a wonderful respite for him as well. So the last way, if we go to the next slide, Jonas, we will see another major way in which presidents approached music. So in this next slide, if we can move on, Jonas, public arts. So there we see at the top, the front page of the New York Times, 1935, it's the Depression. And President Roosevelt has created the Federal Music Project to provide jobs and funds for creators and makers of music. So thousands and thousands of musicians, you can see 300 ensembles were supported, and it actually led to major works composed by significant composers like Aaron Copland and Virgil Thompson. And just across on the right in the top, in the black and white photo, that is President Kennedy on the south lawn of the White House. And he is surrounded there by a youth orchestra from the Boston area, as well as a boys' chorale from a small town in Texas. And who is their audience but children of members of Congress? So here we have a president who has young children, and he and the First Lady are highlighting the importance and the several ways in which children can both make and appreciate music. Going back to the White House South Lawn on the bottom left, this is a jazz festival set up by Jimmy Carter, 1978. As I said, he loved music. And there are dozens of musicians, singers, pianists, trumpeters, vibes. Lionel Hampton, Pearl Bailey sang, Eubie Blake. But you see on stage there, Herbie Hancock, a very young Herbie Hancock, and Dexter Gordon. So it was a wonderful time for all. And it's interesting, it's giving acknowledgement to jazz, which is an art form native to the United States. It's an American creation. And the last large picture we have is that of the Kennedy Center. You can see on the facade, it's the name there is the John F. Kennedy Memorial Center for the Performing Arts. And with the new addition of the Reach on the south side of the building by the river, there are many more references to President Kennedy's legacy, especially with the arts and with children and many other ways. The building itself, the concept of a National Cultural Center was not President Kennedy's idea. In fact, he didn't even sign the legislation, though he did see a model of it before he passed away. It was, in fact, President Eisenhower who signed the National Cultural Center Act in 1958. And then President Kennedy had done some fundraising to help build it. But it wasn't even Eisenhower's idea. The original idea went back to Eleanor Roosevelt back in the 30s. So we are very fortunate to have this wonderful institution in our neighborhood. And it has been the site of the Kennedy Center Honors since 1978, where individuals from different performing arts are honored by their peers. And the White House also plays a role in that event by having a reception for all the honorees just before the performance. But interestingly, now, once the Kennedy Center was up and running, the White House really didn't have to devote that much. They didn't have to put on these lavish jazz festival kinds of events because now there was a Kennedy Center to do that. So we've seen at the various ways presidents have enjoyed and incorporated music into their lives and their presidencies. But let's go on to learn about some presidents who were actually musicians. So if we go chronologically, on the left is Thomas Jefferson, probably one of the most musical of all presidents. He played not only the violin, I think he owned three. He played the cello, the clavichord. His wife also played, including the guitar. Haydn was his favorite composer, but his musical library is quite extensive and apparently includes some very challenging works by people like Handel, Vivaldi, and Boccherini. But because he'd injured his wrist, he wasn't able to play the violin so much while he was president. And then just below, we see a photograph of a much elderly John Quincy Adams, but the man who said that he didn't, as an American, he didn't think he could be very musical. Well, lo and behold, he goes off to Harvard College and he tries to take up the violin, but gives it up because he has difficulty tuning it, and it's very important. So instead, he takes up the flute. And apparently, there were a number of jam sessions late into the night with drinking and conviviality. And in fact, Adams wrote a couple of pieces to be played on the flute. Next to him, the president holding the violin is John Tyler. And this is a statue in Rapid City, South Dakota. Apparently, that city decided to create statues in honor of every president. And lo and behold, they chose to show John Tyler, who was a slave-owning plantation owner in Richmond, whose family was well established in the early days of the country. He's playing a violin. Well, Tyler's passion for that instrument was a long-standing one. In fact, he wanted to make it his career, but his father, who was also a musician and played with Jefferson, because they were neighbors of sorts, persuaded his son, no, you're going to go into politics. But a violin was always present, and even when John Tyler left the White House, he continued to play for the family and others. So it was very much a part of his life. Then we move into the 20th century, and there you see Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson loved to sing. He was a tenor. He actually participated in glee clubs at both Princeton and Johns Hopkins, and he took particular delight in telling people and showing how he could hold a very high note from the Star-Spangled Banner, which I'm sure must have been, since he was the one who signed the executive order, that must have been a piece of music very dear to him, and the fact that he could hold this very high note. But when he was president in 1914, there was some event at the White House, and he was feeling a little down, a little blue, and he did suffer from depression. And so he asked the harpist who was there if the harpist would accompany him after this diplomatic reception, and they played and he sang, "Drink to me only with thine eyes." And apparently it brought him to tears. He really was quite a sentimental music lover. And that's where we'll end. he was rather he was rather sentimental about that. And so after a diplomatic reception in 1914, there was a harpist there, and he asked the harpist to stay to accompany him as he sang "Drink to Me Only with Thine Eyes." And it brought him to tears. So he could be sentimental. And just below there is Warren Harding again. Now we see him with his tuba. He's celebrating the fact that he just got the nomination to run for president from his party. And then above him, there's Harry Truman, again at another piano. But this is not an ordinary piano. This is Mozart's piano in Salzburg. He had gone in 1951 to Salzburg to receive a special gold medal that the city awarded him for his support in enabling the music festival to continue. And I think that was probably the highlight of one of the highlights of Truman's life. He was devoted to the piano. His mother had been his original teacher. He in turn taught his daughter, Margaret, to play. And he always kept a piano by his desk. And the saying is that Truman never passed up a piano. If there was a keyboard around, he would sit down and play. And in fact, when the White House was redone and they moved back in, he was on television, and he played a little bit of music on the Steinway piano that was there. And then we have Richard Nixon, probably as many of us have never seen him, playing the accordion. He was a consummate musician. He actually played by ear. He played the piano, the violin, the clarinet, as well as the accordion. He composed his college fraternity song. He played organ in church. And he even wrote a concerto called Richard's Nixon Piano Concerto No. 1, which I think he performed on Jack Parr's TV show. And when he was in the White House, they had an event, a jazz event, and Pearl Bailey called upon the president to join her on stage to accompany her as she played. And apparently, if you watch the YouTube of it, it's very, very funny. It was really delightful. Nixon also has a claim to fame as having an opera named for him. In 1987, John Adams wrote an opera called Nixon in China. And then here we have President Clinton being gifted with this beautiful red, white, and blue saxophone, very decorative. And there he is in the Oval Office receiving it. And you might recognize the gentleman on the right. That is Senator Larry Pressler, who also has had engagement with our village. So he's somewhat a little closer to home. So while we have a lot of presidents who are musical, we've had others who may not have played. And if we go to the next screen, Jonas, we see presidents who were music lovers. Abraham Lincoln. He couldn't sing, he couldn't play, but he could listen. And he was so in love with opera that on his way to Washington to be inaugurated, he made a detour to New York City. And what was the occasion? It was the American premiere of Verdi's In Ballo and Maschera, of The Masked Ball. What's somewhat ironic is the story of the opera. It involves the assassination of the leader. So I don't know if you think of it as a bit of a precursor, but he thoroughly enjoyed it. And it was very celebratory. At the second act curtain, the cast came out and sang the Star Spangled Banner, and there was a huge American flag on display. And as I mentioned, when he was inaugurated, he requested that an aria from Martha by Flauto, that be played. He also was the first president to invite an opera singer to appear at the White House, and it was a woman who was a native of Washington. The Marine Band was very much aware of Lincoln's love and passion for opera, and what they would do is take choruses from different operas and make arrangements for the president's enjoyment. The president also had a very invited someone. She had come to the White House on these regular days that the president was open for public visitors. And it was a young Native American singer, very much like an opera singer named Laruka. And she was with a man named Mr. Beeson. They had formed a program, Beeson and this young woman, to go around the country and persuade people that the government should return the lands taken from the Native Americans. So this was an issue that was percolating even in Abraham Lincoln's day. And her voice was very, very soothing and was very stirring for people to hear. So music for Lincoln was very much a respite. He had a lot of tragedy as president, and certainly the Civil War, all the deaths and the casualties. So music and the theater. So that's why he attended over 30 events in the 4 years he was in the White House. And he actually said, the truth is, I must have a change of some sort or die. So music and theater were very, very important to him. The other president there is Rutherford B Hayes. He was president in 1876 in a highly contested election that had to be decided by a special commission and Congress. Nonetheless, he and his wife and family were real music lovers. He was a Civil War hero, and here he's now president. And they would have weekly hymn singing, but they also wanted to make the White House a focus for the arts, how the arts had changed. And he promoted Black artists. There was a singer named Marie Serica who came to perform, and she was sponsored and in fact introduced to the attendees at the concert by Frederick Douglass. Hayes and his family also, they went to 50 concerts in 4 years. He loved music of all genres. And the reason we have that, I put the portrait there of John Philip Sousa. Hayes was responsible for making him the leader of the band. Sousa himself had been an apprentice. I didn't realize this was a program that the Marine Band had. It was like an indenture. You signed up and you were like 13 years old and you worked with the band, and that's how the musicianship was increased, because prior to that, most of the musicians were Europeans. So John Philip Sousa is the first American to have the role, and he went on to become known as the March King, and much of the music that we love today and that presidents still enjoy listening to. And then Dwight Eisenhower again. Well, as president, his musical preference, he and Mrs. Eisenhower enjoyed Broadway. They loved going to the theater, My Fair Lady. And they first had a chance to go in to feature Broadway at the White House in 1958. And, music was, a big part of his life and Mrs. Eisenhower's. And they said, well, why don't we make a record and share it with the American public, letting them know what we like, and maybe they can appreciate the music too. So they made an album, and it included Bach and Beethoven, Porgy and Bess, Marian Anderson, the standards like Stardust, Greensleeves, America the Beautiful, and Over There, written by George Cohan. So there you see the record album. And today we might think of President Obama, who likes to publicize his playlist. So this is President Eisenhower doing that way back in the 1950s, the original playlist. But Eisenhower, he enjoyed the military bands and orchestras would play. He loved Lawrence Welk, Guy Lombardo, those kinds of orchestras. And when Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip came in 1957, he invited Fred Waring and his singers from Pennsylvania to come down, and they sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is a very stirring piece, and it actually brought the Eisenhowers to tears. So he was very much moved by music, so much so that it's interesting that when he was dying from his heart condition at Walter Reed in 1969, the very last letter he wrote was to Irving Berlin, in which he thanked Berlin for all his melodies. Pardon me, I'm getting a little teary-eyed here myself. And for the pleasure of listening to his music, which he listened to actually while he was in the hospital. And he writes to, in his letter to Berlin, he says, "No need to reply." So that's how close Eisenhower was, how strongly he felt about at least that particular composer. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see some other people involved with White House music, and these are family members. We see on the top there, the woman playing the harp is Louise Adams, spouse of John Quincy Adams. And the fact that she's in this significant portrait playing the harp indicates to us that it's very meaningful to her and something for which she was quite renowned. The young girl playing the harp just beneath her is Abby Fillmore, the daughter of Millard Fillmore. She also played the guitar and the piano, and like President Clinton, she had her own music room in the White House. The woman just above her in the full-length portrait is Caroline Harrison, First Lady to Benjamin Harrison as president. She actually was a professional musician and taught college-level music. The First Lady in the center there seated is Nellie Taft, President William Howard Taft's wife. They met in Cincinnati. She was a real music lover, but she did something amazing. She founded the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra in 1893, and she managed it for several years. She handled the auditions, she did the contracting, fundraising, she did outreach, educational programming, and she said, at last I found a practical method for expressing and making use of my love and knowledge of music. Well, so deep was her love of music that when she did become First Lady, having lived with the president previously in the Philippines, where she saw these lovely band concerts, she wanted to bring music to the people. So not only did she bring the cherry trees, but in that part of the park in our neighborhood, she set up a bandstand. And there were these regular weekly regular performances. The orchestra was led by a Black conductor. And while that bandstand no longer exists, the military bands do play at the Jefferson Memorial on the tidal basin. The woman with the hat is another First Lady, Florence Harding. She's married to Warren Harding, who had his own brass band. And she also was musically trained. She wanted to be a concert pianist. And the young woman we see in the top right, who looks a bit vampish there, is Woodrow Wilson's oldest daughter, Margaret Woodrow Wilson. She attended Goucher College in Baltimore and then studied voice and piano at the Peabody Institute in Baltimore. She had her debut while her father was president in 1915 with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And then she performed at benefits during the war for the Red Cross, and continued to sing. But she never married. She and her two sisters were suffragists. Her two younger sisters did marry, but she saw that when her father died, he'd left her a trust. And the condition was that when she married, the funds would be managed by the spouse. And she did not care for that. And she ultimately made her way to India and became a spiritualist and died there. So she's a very interesting woman. And then the other Margaret, daughter of a president who became a singer, Margaret Truman. There we see her in 1940 playing the piano with her father, who I said was her first music teacher. She graduated from George Washington University and then studied singing with the same teacher who taught Beverly Sills. She had a 10-year concert career all around the country. She made recordings and then ultimately left music and became a very, very well-known mystery writer. So family members too were making a mark with music at the White House. So what programs were actually done there? Let's move on to the next screen if we could, Jonas. And how did these programs come about? Well, Rutherford B Hayes learned by the 1870s, there's a lot going on. They needed someone to help organize. But in the early days, things were very small, intimate, very European-like. But by the mid-century, we started to see child prodigies. On the top left there, you see Blind Tom. He was an amazing genius. He could listen to a song once and repeat it. He sang songs in multiple languages. He composed over 100 piano works. Sadly, he was taken advantage of by the slave owner who had owned his parents, enslaved his parents. And when they were made free, he persuaded them to allow him to become Tom's legal guardian and took him all over the country concertizing, made a fortune off of Thomas Green Wiggins. And the other child prodigy is a little girl in the dress by the piano, Teresa Carreño. She and her family had escaped from Venezuela due to political turmoil. They were very musical. She played the piano. She was amazing. Abraham Lincoln invites her to play at the White House. She's 9 years old. She wasn't happy with the piano. It was out of tune. But she later went on to an amazing career internationally, concertizing on the piano. She was a composer, she was a conductor, and she sang opera. She had 5 husbands, I think, and several children. So she was an amazing talent. It was also a time when musical groups, you see the Hutchinson family on the bottom left, as well as the Fisk Jubilee Singers from Fisk University on the right, the all-Black ensemble. They were able, with the building of the railroad, ensembles now were able to travel around the country to go to different places. And the Hutchinsons were abolitionists. Their music focused on social issues. They were good friends with Frederick Douglass. They actually composed a piece, I Am a Fugitive, and put his picture on the cover. They went with him when he went to England in 1845. And they sang for many, many presidents. I think it was 6 or 7 different presidents. And the Fisk Jubilee Singers, very, very musical. They first sang for Ulysses Grant. Roland Hayes, the tenor I mentioned earlier, got his start with the Fisk Ensemble. And they also played for several presidents. The 2 women in the center, that's Jenny Lind at the bottom, the Swedish Nightingale. She came to the United States when Millard Fillmore was president, and she did 2 public performances, and he got tickets for both. She was only 30 at the time, but she'd already sung 700 programs. And then above her is a woman named, who went by the name the Black Patty. Her actual name was Sissy Retta Jones. And she was extraordinary. She was the highest paid performer, Black performer of her era. She studied at the New England Conservatory of Music, and she had all the qualities. James Weldon Johnson, who composed the Teddy Roosevelt campaign song, said she had natural voice, a physical figure, the grand air, and engaging personality, all the things that you would want in a diva. She toured internationally, and she was conducted by Antonin Dvorak. When she performed in Louisville in 1893, we think of Marian Anderson and what happened to her in 1939. But here is Sisieta, Black Patty, in 1893, registering her complaint that it was a segregated audience. And then the last person I wanted to highlight is the violinist up there in the right corner. That is Joseph Douglas, the grandson of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass himself taught himself the violin when he was in Scotland, taught his son and then his grandson to play. Joseph Douglass performed at the Columbia Exposition with Black Patty, and he also played for Theodore Roosevelt and other presidents. He was the first violinist to do a recording in 1914, and he toured internationally. So those are 19th century performers. What about after 1900? Well, let's go to the next slide, and very quickly, you'll see that beautiful piano, that Steinway piano, that was given by the Steinway Company to the White House in 1903. It is now housed at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and there was, by the 1870s, there were piano companies everywhere. Every house practically had a piano. In fact, it said there were more pianos than bathtubs. And so every company wanted to say, well, we have a piano in the White House. So Steinway definitely did. And there may have been others, but this is an art piece. And some of the pianists that you see above, there's Sergei Rachmaninoff on the top left. He played, I think, 3 times for the Coolidges on that piano. Then you have Paderewski there in the center. He played 10 times for 6 different presidents. He actually became Poland's leader. As part of the Treaty of Versailles, he became the leader of Poland after World War I. But he knew Herbert Hoover at that time, because Hoover had arranged food aid for the Polish people. Paderewski in 1941 is back in the United States. He dies here, and FDR says he should be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. I think his remains have since been repatriated. And that is a very young Vladimir Horowitz looking at us with the bow tie. And he came back to play for Jimmy Carter as well for a televised series. The gentleman just above him is Todd Duncan, the baritone, who originated the role of Porgy and Bess. As we just learned, that was one of Eisenhower's favorite works. And so he also performed at the White House. Then we move across and we see President Mrs. Kennedy greeting ballet dancers with the American Ballet Theater. They had just performed Billy the Kid by Aaron Copland. And so dance is now starting to show up. The large group at the bottom are from Eisenhower's invitation to performers from 5 different musicals, including West Side Story and Pajama Game. Harold Prince, I think, is the great producer, is up there in the top left corner. And then Lyndon Johnson. He also had Broadway people, and that is Carol Channing from Hello, Dolly. You move up and you see Ronald Reagan with friends from California, Perry Como and Frank Sinatra. And then under the administration of the first President Bush, We see Gloria Estefan performing, and she's still very much a performer in demand. And then as we move into the 21st century, of course, I have to put Lin-Manuel Miranda from Hamilton. So this gives you, if we close with this last slide, just to wrap up and say that there, you can see that there are many ways that music has been a part of the life of the presidents and their family and our nation to a great extent. And it reflects both their personal beliefs and political issues, and certainly has affected our culture and world affairs. So thank you for listening. I rushed through, but wanted to leave some time for questions.
Okay, we do have a couple minutes left. If anyone has any questions, again, feel free to pop them in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask away.
I should mention that there will be a handout coming along, being sent to you all, and it includes a compendium of campaign songs, Stravinsky's elegy that he wrote for Kennedy. There's a recording of the Native American opera that was done originally for Teddy Roosevelt, that was restaged for the first time at Carnegie Hall in 2013. We have Luciano Pavarotti singing the aria from Martha. We've got Lin-Manuel Miranda doing his hip hop thing. And we have a recording of the Pablo Casals concert with the Kennedys, along with a recording of Margaret Wilson singing, as well as Margaret Truman. So I hope you'll enjoy listening to those in full. I didn't want to interrupt the program because I think they're worth listening to give you a sense of what was going on in the White House back in those days. So does anybody was anybody surprised? Was there a surprise among the presidents and what they listened to or enjoyed?
Lorna, I will unmute myself. This is Christina.
Hello.
And I probably should turn my camera back on too. Thank you very much for another wonderful program. I always enjoy your programs.
Oh, thank you.
And I guess I was most surprised by the number of presidents who were actual musicians. Not so surprised by presidents like Jefferson, etc., because during that era, if you couldn't entertain yourself musically and read, it wasn't like you had a TV set or a radio to turn on or a phonograph. I mean, it was either do it yourself or bring somebody in or quiet. So that's understandable. But some of the later people where we did have built-in distractions, that's fascinating. And the professional musicians that came out of the children, and very fascinating. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Well, just a little footnote. Ronald Reagan and Calvin Coolidge played the harmonica. So everyone's going to rush over to the Kennedy Center, or wouldn't it be nice if they still had those concerts on the lawn of the White House?
I want to thank you all very much for joining us on this Thursday afternoon. And if anyone has any last questions or comments, I'll leave it open for a second or two. But thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, my great pleasure. And music is important.